Marina Castellano adjusted her grip on the steering wheel as the city skyline disappeared in her rearview mirror. The highway stretched ahead like a ribbon of possibility, each mile marker representing another step away from the life she'd carefully constructed and watched crumble in spectacular fashion. Her designer luggage sat in the trunk, hastily packed in the 2 hours between discovering the truth and deciding to leave everything behind. The engagement ring she'd worn for 8 months now rested at the bottom of the Chicago River, a 3-carat symbol of lies she'd thrown from the Michigan Avenue Bridge. 3 days earlier, Marina had been the youngest senior marketing director at Westbrook Industries, commanding a team of 42 people and an annual budget of $12 million. She had a corner office on the 34th floor with panoramic views of Lake Michigan, a penthouse apartment in River North, and a fiancé who managed a hedge fund downtown. On paper, her life looked perfect. Behind the carefully curated Instagram posts and professional accolades, everything was rotting from within. The discovery happened accidentally, as these things often do. Marina had left work early with a migraine, something that had been happening more frequently as wedding planning intensified. She'd taken medication and fallen asleep on the couch, waking around 9 in the evening to find her phone buzzing incessantly. But these weren't her notifications. In her medicated haze, she'd grabbed Dylan's phone from the coffee table instead of her own. The messages were from someone named Jess. The preview text was innocent enough, discussing weekend plans, but something about the tone felt wrong. Marina knew she shouldn't look further. Privacy was sacred in relationships, boundaries were important, and she trusted Dylan completely. At least she thought she did. Her finger hovered over the phone, reason warring with instinct. Instinct won. What she found shattered her carefully ordered world into irreparable fragments. Messages spanning back 14 months overlapping their entire engagement. Photos of Dylan with a woman Marina had never met. The two of them in restaurants Marina recognized. On a beach vacation Dylan had claimed was a business trip, in what appeared to be the woman's apartment. But worse than the infidelity was the content of their conversations. Dylan spoke to Jess with warmth and authenticity he'd never shown Marina. He called her his soulmate, made plans for a future together, complained about having to maintain the charade with Marina until the merger with her father's company was finalized. Marina sat in the darkness of their living room, scrolling through months of deception, and felt something fundamental break inside her. Not just her heart, though that certainly shattered. Something deeper fractured, the foundation upon which she'd built her identity. She'd always been the smart one, the capable one, the woman who had everything figured out. How had she missed this? How had she failed to see what was right in front of her? When Dylan arrived home around midnight, he found Marina sitting exactly where she'd been for 3 hours, his phone on the coffee table beside her, screen illuminated with evidence of his betrayal. He didn't deny it. He didn't apologize. He simply sighed, loosened his tie, and said they needed to talk about this rationally. As if there was a rational explanation for systematically lying to someone for over a year. As if rationality could fix what he'd destroyed. The argument that followed was brief but devastating. Dylan explained with infuriating calm that he'd gotten involved with Marina because their family's business connections made sense professionally. The engagement had been strategic timing, planned to coincide with merger negotiations. He'd never intended for things to get this complicated, but Jess had happened, and what could he do about genuine feelings? He spoke about love and deception with the same detached analysis he used for quarterly earnings reports. Marina listened. To him, reduced their relationship to a business transaction and felt fury unlike anything she'd ever experienced. She genuinely loved this man. She'd introduced him to her family, integrated him into every aspect of her life, planned a future where they'd build something meaningful together. And to him, she'd been nothing more than a useful connection, a stepping stone to professional advancement. She told him to leave. He refused, pointing out that his name was on the lease. They'd signed it together 6 months ago when they moved from her smaller apartment to this spacious 2-bedroom with the skyline view. Marina had paid the security deposit and first 3 months' rent, but technically they were co-tenants. Dylan suggested she should be the one to find somewhere else to stay, at least temporarily, until they could sort out logistics like adults. That's when Marina did something completely out of character. She, who'd always been measured and professional, who prided herself on emotional control and strategic thinking, swept her arm across the coffee table and sent his laptop, a crystal vase and 2 wine glasses crashing to the floor. The violence of the gesture shocked them both. Dylan took a step backward, genuine fear flashing across his face. Good, Marina thought. Let him be afraid. Let him feel a fraction of the chaos he'd created. She grabbed her purse and keys and left. She drove aimlessly through Chicago's late-night streets, not sure where to go. She couldn't face her parents, couldn't bear to see the disappointment in her father's eyes when he learned the golden boy he'd welcomed into the family was a calculating fraud. She couldn't call her sister, who'd just given birth 2 weeks ago and didn't need this stress. Her closest work friends were all connected to Dylan through various professional networks. The life she'd built was so intertwined with his that extracting herself felt impossible. Marina ended up at a 24-hour diner on the north side, sitting in a corner booth with terrible coffee and a piece of pie she couldn't taste. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from Dylan, alternating between apologetic and accusatory. She turned it off. When the waitress came by at 3 a.m. to refill her coffee, she asked if Marina was okay. The genuine concern in her voice, coming from a complete stranger, finally broke through Marina's shock. She started crying, silent tears that wouldn't stop, while the waitress sat down across from her and held her hand without asking questions. The next morning, Marina called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. She checked into a hotel near O'Hare Airport, not sure what she planned to do but needing distance from the apartment, from Dylan, from everything that reminded her of the life she'd been living. She turned her phone back on and found 73 messages waiting. Most were from Dylan, but there were also concerned texts from her assistant wondering if she was all right, a voicemail from her mother about final wedding venue decisions, and an email from Dylan's mother thanking her for being such a wonderful addition to their family. That email did it. Marina couldn't maintain this facade any longer. She composed a carefully worded message to her parents explaining that the engagement was off and she needed some time away. She kept it vague, not ready to detail Dylan's betrayal but making clear this wasn't temporary cold feet. Her mother called immediately, but Marina let it go to voicemail. She then sent a message to her assistant asking her to clear her calendar for the rest of the week, citing a family emergency. For 2 days, Marina existed in limbo. She ordered room service, avoided mirrors, and tried to process what had happened. But processing required reflection, and reflection led to questions she couldn't answer. How long had she been living a lie? Had any of it been real? What did it say about her that she'd failed to see the truth? These thoughts spiraled endlessly, each one leading to darker places. On the 3rd day, Marina made a decision. She couldn't return to her old life, not yet, maybe not ever. The apartment was contaminated with memories. Her job, while prestigious, had consumed her life, leaving no room for friends or interests outside of work. The social circle she'd cultivated was mostly professional contacts or Dylan's connections. When she stripped away the career achievements and relationship status, what remained? Who was Marina Castellano underneath all the carefully constructed layers? She needed to find out, and she couldn't do that in Chicago, surrounded by reminders of who she'd been trying to be. Marina pulled out her laptop and began researching. She wasn't sure what she was looking for until she found it. A small coastal town in Northern California called Ravens Bay. Population 8,000, known for its artistic community, pristine beaches, and complete disconnection from the urban intensity she'd been drowning in. There was a month-to-month rental available, a cottage 2 blocks from the ocean, furnished and available immediately. The rent was less than she'd been paying for parking in Chicago. She booked it without overthinking, knowing that rational analysis would talk her out of this impulsive decision. She sent her resignation email to Westbrook Industries, effective immediately, forfeiting her stock options and bonus but freeing herself from obligations. She called her landlord and explained she was breaking the lease, offering to pay the penalty fee and forfeit her security deposit. She scheduled movers to pack her belongings and put them in storage. Then she got in her car and started driving west. That was how Marina found herself on Interstate 80 as dawn broke over Iowa, driving toward a future that was terrifyingly undefined. For someone who'd always had a 5-year plan, who'd mapped out her career trajectory at 22 and followed it precisely, this directionless journey felt both liberating and horrifying. She'd thrown away everything she'd worked for, or had she finally stopped pretending that achievements and status equated to fulfillment? The drive took 4 days, Marina stopped when she was tired, ate when she was hungry, and didn't check her phone except to navigate. She watched the landscape transform from Midwest plains to mountain ranges to desert, to finally the lush forests of Northern California. With each passing mile, she felt layers of her former identity sloughing off like dead skin. She arrived in Ravens Bay on a Tuesday afternoon in late April. The town was exactly as the photos had shown. A picturesque main street with independently owned shops, galleries featuring local artists' work, a bookstore with a cat sleeping in the window, and a coffee shop that smelled like heaven. The ocean was visible from almost everywhere, a constant blue presence that seemed to promise peace. The cottage exceeded her expectations. It was small, maybe 800 square feet, but filled with natural light. Hardwood floors, a brick fireplace, windows facing the water, and a tiny garden in back that had been neglected but showed signs of previous care. The furniture was mismatched but comfortable. The kitchen was outdated but functional, and the bathroom had a clawfoot tub perfect for long soaks. It wasn't luxury, but it was real in a way her Chicago penthouse had never been. Marina unpacked her 2 suitcases and felt ridiculous at how little she'd brought from her former life. Designer clothes that felt completely wrong here, high heels she'd never wear on beach paths, jewelry that had lost all meaning. She made a mental note to donate most of it. That first week in Ravens Bay passed in a blur of sleep and solitude. Marina walked the beach for hours, letting the rhythm of waves slowly calm the chaos in her mind. She bought groceries from the local market and learned to cook simple meals instead of ordering delivery. She sat in the garden with coffee each morning, watching hummingbirds visit the neglected flower beds. She avoided people as much as possible, not ready for small talk or explanations. But isolation couldn't last forever. On day 8, while getting coffee from the shop on Main Street, Marina was approached by a woman about her age with paint-stained hands and wild curly hair barely contained by a bandana. "You're the new tenant at the Whitmore Cottage, right?" the woman asked with a friendly smile. "I'm River. Yes, that's my actual name. My parents were very committed to the whole hippie aesthetic. I live 3 doors down and wanted to introduce myself." Marina wasn't ready for friendship, but River's warmth was disarming. They ended up talking for over an hour, River doing most of the speaking while Marina listened and slowly relaxed. River was a ceramic artist who taught classes at the community center and sold her work at galleries throughout Northern California. She'd moved to Ravens Bay 5 years ago after burning out in San Francisco's tech industry and never looked back. "This place has a way of collecting people who needed to reinvent themselves," River said casually, as if complete life transformation was perfectly normal. "Half the residents here are refugees from bigger cities, running from something or towards something or both. Nobody asked too many questions. We're all just trying to figure out who we are without all the external pressure." Those words resonated deeply with Marina. She found herself opening up slightly, mentioning that she'd recently ended a relationship and left her job, needing space to recalibrate. River nodded understanding and didn't push for details. Instead, she invited Marina to a community potluck that weekend, mentioning that it was low pressure and she could leave whenever she wanted. Marina surprised herself by agreeing. Saturday evening, she made a simple pasta salad and walked to the community center, a converted firehouse that now housed various gathering spaces. The potluck was exactly as River had described, casual, welcoming, with about 40 people ranging from young families to elderly artists. Nobody interrogated Marina about her background. They introduced themselves, shared food, and included her in conversations without forcing participation. She met Ben, a former corporate lawyer now running a kayaking tour company. Sarah, who'd been a high-powered executive assistant and now managed the local bookstore. James, previously in finance, currently a woodworker creating beautiful furniture from reclaimed materials. Each person had their own story of leaving behind conventional success to pursue something more meaningful in this small coastal haven. Marina left the potluck feeling something she hadn't experienced in years. Possibility. These people had reconstructed their lives around authenticity rather than achievement. They worked enough to pay bills but prioritized time in nature, creative pursuits, and genuine community connections. They weren't running from responsibility. They were running toward a different definition of a life well lived. Over the following weeks, Marina gradually integrated herself into Ravens Bay's rhythms. She started taking ceramics classes with River, discovering unexpected joy in working with clay. Her early attempts were terrible. Lopsided bowls, collapsed vases, mugs with handles attached at weird angles. But River encouraged her to embrace the imperfection.
Clay doesn't lie, she told Marina.
Whatever energy you bring to it shows up in the work. Right now you're bringing tension and fear of failure. Try bringing curiosity instead. Marina also began helping at Sarah's bookstore a few days a week. It wasn't paid work, just volunteering. But she loved the gentle pace and conversations with customers. She read more in those first 2 months than she had in the previous 5 years. Fiction, poetry, memoirs, genres she'd dismissed as impractical when her reading consisted solely of business books and industry reports. She discovered she had opinions about literature, preferences for certain authors, the ability to recommend books based on customers' moods rather than bestseller lists. Ben convinced her to try kayaking. Despite Marina's protests that she wasn't athletic, she'd spent years in expensive gyms working with personal trainers to maintain a certain aesthetic, but she'd never actually enjoyed physical activity. Kayaking was different. Gliding across the calm bay at sunrise, watching sea otters play and seals sunbathe on rocks, feeling her muscles work in harmony with the water's movement. This was exercise that fed her soul rather than just maintaining her appearance. The physical transformation surprised her. Without the stress of her corporate job, Marina's chronic migraines disappeared. Her skin cleared up. She lost weight without trying. Not from deprivation, but from eating real food and moving her body joyfully. She stopped wearing makeup daily and discovered she preferred her face without it. She cut her long, carefully highlighted hair into a shorter, more practical style that required minimal maintenance. Looking in the mirror became less about evaluation and more about recognition. But the internal transformation was slower and more painful. Marina still woke some mornings paralyzed by panic, convinced she'd made a terrible mistake throwing away her career. She'd have moments of desperate missing for her old life. Not because it had been fulfilling, but because it had been familiar. She stalked Dylan's social media late at night, torturing herself with photos of him looking perfectly fine, apparently unaffected by their breakup. She wrestled with feelings of failure and shame, wondering what people from her former life thought of her dramatic disappearance. River found her crying on the beach one afternoon about 6 weeks into her Ravens Bay residency. Marina had been scrolling through LinkedIn, seeing former colleagues receiving promotions and closing deals, and she'd spiraled into despair. Had she destroyed her future for a temporary escape? Would she ever be able to return to that level of professional success? Did she even want to? River sat beside her in the sand and didn't offer empty platitudes. "Grief isn't linear," she said quietly. "You're mourning a version of yourself you invested years in becoming. That person wasn't entirely authentic, but she wasn't entirely false either. You don't have to completely reject who you were to become who you're meant to be. You can integrate the parts that were real and release the parts that weren't." Those words gave Marina permission to stop seeing her transformation as all or nothing. She could acknowledge that her marketing skills were real and valuable, without returning to the toxic environment that had exploited them. She could appreciate the discipline and work ethic she'd developed, without letting them consume her entire identity. She could honor what she'd accomplished while choosing a different path forward. Around this time, Marina's mother finally tracked her down. She'd been leaving increasingly concerned voicemails, and Marina knew she couldn't avoid the conversation forever. They spoke for over 3 hours, Marina finally explaining everything about Dylan's betrayal, her decision to leave, and her current situation. Her mother listened without judgment, and when Marina finished, she said something unexpected. "I'm proud of you." Marina had been braced for disappointment or concern, not pride. Her mother explained that she'd always sensed Marina was performing a role, rather than living authentically. "You were so focused on achievement that you forgot to ask if you actually enjoyed what you were achieving," she said. "I didn't know how to tell you that without seeming like I didn't support your success. I'm sorry I didn't try harder to have that conversation earlier." They talked about family expectations, about the pressure Marina had felt as the eldest daughter to be exceptional, about how that pressure had led her to equate worth with accomplishment. Her mother shared her own story of giving up a promising law career when Marina was born, a decision she'd wrestled with, but ultimately never regretted. "There are many ways to live a meaningful life," she said. "You're discovering yours. That takes more courage than following someone else's script." That conversation marked a turning point. Marina felt released from obligations she'd been carrying without fully realizing their weight. She started thinking about her future not as reclaiming her past, but as creating something entirely new. She didn't know exactly what that looked like yet, but she was learning to be comfortable with uncertainty. As summer arrived, Ravens Bay transformed. The population swelled with tourists, the beaches filled with families, and local businesses thrived. Marina increased her hours at the bookstore, now getting paid and handling some of the marketing. Her first professional work since leaving Chicago. She helped Sarah develop a social media strategy, create a monthly newsletter, and organize author events. The work was modest in scale but satisfying in impact. She also continued with ceramics, her skills slowly improving. River invited her to participate in a group show at a local gallery, which terrified Marina. Showing imperfect creative work felt far more vulnerable than presenting polished marketing campaigns. But she agreed, selecting her 6 best pieces, 3 bowls, 2 vases, and a set of mugs for display. To her astonishment, 4 pieces sold opening night. To real people who appreciated her beginner's aesthetic enough to pay actual money for it. The validation wasn't about the sales, though that was encouraging. It was about being seen for something she'd created purely from personal expression, rather than strategic objectives. Nobody had commissioned these pieces. No focus group had approved the color palette. No ROI justified the hours spent forming and refining each item. They existed simply because Marina wanted to make them, and people found value in that authenticity. Ben became a close friend over those summer months. They kayaked together most mornings. The physical activity and easy conversation providing structure to Marina's days. He shared his own story of leaving law after a partner at his firm was indicted for fraud. He'd been peripherally involved in the case, ethically clear but morally compromised by association. The experience shattered his idealism about justice and the legal profession. "I spent 7 years becoming an excellent lawyer," he told Marina one morning as they paddled toward a secluded cove. "But being excellent at something that damages your soul is worse than being mediocre at something that nourishes it. I make a fraction of what I used to earn, live in a tiny apartment, and drive a truck that's older than most of my former interns. But I sleep soundly now. That's priceless." His words resonated with Marina's evolving understanding of success. She'd defined herself by external markers, title, salary, zip code, relationship status, and lost sight of internal ones like peace, joy, authentic connection, and purpose. Redefining success around those internal metrics felt revolutionary. As fall approached, Marina realized she'd been in Ravens Bay for 6 months. What began as temporary escape had become something resembling a life. She'd established routines, formed genuine friendships, discovered creative outlets, and began healing from betrayal. She still had moments of doubt, still sometimes wondered if she was hiding rather than growing. But those moments came less frequently. Then she received an unexpected email from Dylan. He'd tracked down her contact information through her family, and he wanted to talk. His message was long, attempting to explain his behavior, expressing regret and asking for forgiveness. He mentioned that he'd called off his relationship with Jess, that the business merger had fallen apart anyway, and that he'd been in therapy working on his issues. He wondered if Marina would consider speaking with him, not necessarily for reconciliation, but for closure. Marina's first instinct was to delete the email without responding. But River, when consulted, offered different perspective. "You don't owe him anything," she said, "but this might be an opportunity for you to see how far you've come. Sometimes facing the past from your present position shows you just how much you've grown." After several days of consideration, Marina agreed to a phone call. She chose to take it while walking her favorite beach trail, wanting the grounding presence of the ocean during what would likely be a difficult conversation. Dylan sounded different, less confident, more genuine, or perhaps just more desperate. He apologized extensively, acknowledged the damage he'd caused, and explained that losing Marina had forced him to confront patterns in his behavior that had been destroying his relationships for years. Marina listened without interruption, then spoke her truth calmly and clearly. She told him that his betrayal had devastated her, but ultimately freed her from a life that wasn't authentic. She thanked him for inadvertently giving her permission to stop performing a role and start discovering herself. She acknowledged his apology but made clear she had no interest in rebuilding any kind of relationship, romantic or otherwise. That chapter of her life was completely closed. What surprised her was the absence of anger. Marina had expected residual rage or bitterness, but she felt mostly indifference. Dylan was simply someone she used to know, someone whose choices had catalyzed her transformation but no longer held power over her emotional landscape. When the call ended, she felt lighter, as if releasing weight she hadn't realized she was still carrying. That evening, Marina sat in her cottage's small garden with a journal, something River had encouraged her to start. She reflected on the past 8 months, listing changes she'd made and lessons she'd learned. The list was long. She'd discovered she was creative in ways that had nothing to do with marketing strategies. She'd learned that achievement without fulfillment was hollow. She'd realized that vulnerability and authenticity attracted deeper connections than performance and perfection. She'd discovered strength in choosing discomfort over complacency. She'd learned that transformation required releasing who you thought you should be to discover who you actually were. She also acknowledged ongoing challenges. Financially, she was depleting her savings and needed to develop sustainable income. Professionally, she'd abandoned a career she'd spent years building but hadn't yet identified what she wanted to pursue instead. Emotionally, she still struggled with uncertainty and occasional regret. She was learning to be alone without being lonely, but that was an ongoing practice rather than an achieved state. Winter brought a different energy to Ravens Bay. The tourists disappeared, locals reclaimed the beaches, and the community turned inward with a coziness Marina found comforting. She spent evenings at the coffee shop, working on a laptop she'd barely touched since arriving. Not corporate work, but personal writing. She started documenting her journey, not sure if it would become a blog or a memoir or simply private reflection, but needing to process her experience through words. The writing surprised her. Marina had always been articulate in professional contexts, crafting compelling presentations and persuasive proposals. But this was different. This was raw and honest, exploring vulnerability she'd never shown in her previous work. She wrote about failure and shame, about the terror of starting over, about discovering that the person she'd been trying to become was preventing her from becoming who she was meant to be. Sarah read some of Marina's early pieces and encouraged her to share them publicly. "There are so many people trapped in lives that look successful but feel suffocating," she said. "Your story could give them permission to imagine different possibilities." Hesitantly, Marina started a blog called Reconstructing Marina. She posted weekly essays about her experience leaving her corporate career, moving to a small town and attempting to build an authentic life. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within weeks, she had thousands of readers, many sharing their own stories of feeling trapped by conventional definitions of success. Her inbox filled with messages from people contemplating similar transformations, but paralyzed by fear. The blog led to unexpected opportunities. A podcast focused on career transitions invited her for an interview. A magazine that featured stories about alternative lifestyles commissioned an article. A small publisher expressed interest in her potentially developing the blog into a book. None of this generated significant income yet, but it suggested a possible path forward, helping others navigate the journey she was still actively traveling. Marina also took a part-time job at River's ceramic studio, assisting with classes and managing the retail space. The work combined skills from her former career, marketing, customer service, business management, with her new interests in art and community. The pay was modest, but paired with blog income and careful budgeting, it made her Ravens Bay life sustainable. She still had difficult days when she missed the validation of professional achievement, the financial security of a substantial salary, the identity that came from being important in a recognized field. Days when she felt foolish for throwing away her career over a personal betrayal. Days when she wondered if she was brave or simply running away. But those days became less frequent as a different kind of confidence developed. Marina was learning to trust herself in ways she never had when external validation defined her worth. She was discovering that discomfort could be generative rather than something to avoid. She was building a life based on her actual values rather than inherited expectations. 1 year after arriving in Ravens Bay, Marina organized a dinner party in her cottage. She invited River, Ben, Sarah, and a few other friends she'd made. They crowded around her small table, sharing food and stories and laughter. At some point during the evening, Marina looked around at these people who'd welcomed her into their community, who'd supported her transformation without judgment, and felt profound gratitude. This wasn't the life she'd imagined for herself at 22 when she mapped out her future. It wasn't the life she'd been building with Dylan in Chicago. It wasn't impressive on paper or easily explained at hypothetical high school reunions. But it was hers, authentically and completely. She'd chosen it consciously rather than following a predetermined script. After everyone left, Marina walked down to the beach despite the cold. The ocean was calm, reflecting moonlight in silver ripples. She stood at the water's edge and thought about the woman she'd been a year ago. Terrified, heartbroken, convinced her life was over. That woman couldn't have imagined the peace she now felt. That woman couldn't have conceived that losing everything she thought she wanted would reveal what she actually needed. Marina wasn't finished transforming. She suspected transformation was lifelong work, not a destination but an ongoing practice. She still didn't have all the answers. She was still figuring out how to turn her blog into sustainable work, how to balance solitude and community, how to maintain the peace she'd found in Ravens Bay if she eventually needed or wanted to leave. But she was learning to be comfortable with those uncertainties. The new year brought fresh challenges and opportunities. Marina's blog had grown to over 50,000 regular readers, creating pressure to produce content consistently. While she appreciated the audience, she noticed herself starting to perform again, crafting stories for engagement rather than authentic expression. It was a subtle shift, but familiar enough to concern her. She talked with River about this tension during one of their weekly ceramic sessions. The challenge with sharing your journey publicly is that it can become another role you perform, River observed while centering clay on her wheel. You start curating your transformation for an audience instead of just living it. That's not necessarily wrong, but it requires awareness about when you're sharing authentically versus when you're creating content. Marina recognized the truth in this. Some of her recent blog posts had felt forced, written because she needed to post something rather than because she had something genuine to share. She was starting to mythologize her own story, presenting her transformation as more linear and complete than it actually was. She was, in subtle ways, beginning to construct another persona for public consumption. She decided to address this directly in her next post, writing honestly about the pressure she felt to have her life figured out, to present a tidy narrative of transformation, to be inspirational rather than simply honest. She admitted that some days she still missed aspects of her old life, that she sometimes questioned if she'd made the right choices, that authentic living was harder and messier than inspirational quotes suggested. The response to that post was her most positive yet. Readers thanked her for the honesty, sharing their own struggles with the gap between aspirational living and actual reality. Many admitted they'd been following her blog hoping for a formula for transformation, but appreciated the reminder that there wasn't one. Each person's journey was unique, requiring them to figure out what authenticity meant in their specific context. This experience taught Marina an important lesson about community and vulnerability. People didn't need her to have all the answers or present a perfected version of alternative living. They needed permission to struggle, validation that transformation was difficult, and evidence that imperfect progress was still progress. She could provide that simply by continuing to show up honestly. Spring arrived with spectacular wildflower blooms covering the coastal hills. Marina organized a hiking group that met every Saturday, exploring different trails around Ravens Bay. The group attracted a mix of longtime residents and newer arrivals, all seeking connection with nature and community. These weekly hikes became one of Marina's favorite rituals, combining physical movement, beautiful landscapes, and meaningful conversations. On one particularly beautiful hike, Marina found herself walking beside an older woman named Eleanor, who'd recently moved to Ravens Bay from Boston. Eleanor had just retired after 40 years as a physician and was struggling with the loss of identity that came with ending her medical career. She'd spent decades defining herself through her work, and retirement felt like erasure rather than reward. Marina shared her own experience of leaving her career, the disorientation that followed, and the slow process of discovering identity beyond professional achievement. Eleanor listened intently, occasionally asking questions, and at the end of the hike thanked Marina for the conversation. "I've been mourning the end of who I was," Eleanor said. You've helped me see this as an opportunity to discover who I might become." That conversation stayed with Marina for days. She realized that her transformation wasn't just personal. It had equipped her to support others navigating similar transitions. She'd developed hard-won wisdom about identity, authenticity, and the courage required to choose differently. Maybe this was part of her purpose in Ravens Bay. Not just healing herself, but helping others find their own paths to wholeness. She started offering informal coaching sessions for people considering major life changes. Nothing formal or certificated, just conversations over coffee where she shared her experience and listened to others' struggles. These sessions were deeply fulfilling, reminding Marina that the skills she'd developed in her corporate career, strategic thinking, problem-solving, communication, were valuable even in completely different contexts. Several people she spoke with mentioned struggling with the financial aspects of making major changes. How could they leave stable jobs to pursue more meaningful work when they had mortgages, student loans, families to support? Marina didn't have simple answers, but she helped them examine their actual financial needs versus culturally defined expectations about lifestyle. Many discovered they could live on significantly less than they thought if they were willing to reconsider what necessities actually were. This work felt purposeful in ways her previous career never had. She wasn't selling products people didn't need or manipulating emotional responses for commercial gain. She was witnessing people find courage to choose authenticity over convention, supporting them through the fear that inevitably accompanied that choice. The impact was intimate rather than large-scale, but that intimacy made it meaningful. By summer, Marina had been in Ravens Bay for 18 months. Her life had settled into rhythms that felt sustainable rather than temporary. She'd renewed her cottage lease indefinitely, fully committed to making this place home rather than just a transitional refuge. She'd expanded her work at the ceramic studio to nearly full-time, taking on more teaching responsibilities. Her blog had evolved into a weekly newsletter with a smaller but more engaged audience. She'd developed a circle of deep friendships rather than a large network of superficial contacts. Financially, she was stable, if not abundant. She earned enough to cover expenses and contribute to modest savings, though nothing like her previous income. She'd sold most of her designer possessions, keeping only what she actually used and loved. She'd learned to distinguish between needs and wants, discovering that most of what she'd previously considered necessary was actually just socially expected. She lived simply but didn't feel deprived. Marina's relationship with her family had deepened through this period. Her parents visited Ravens Bay, initially concerned they'd find her living in delusional poverty, but left reassured and even inspired by her transformation. Her sister, navigating her own challenges with new motherhood, started calling Marina for advice, valuing her perspective on choosing authenticity over performance. Even her younger brother, still pursuing a conventional path in corporate law, admitted to envying Marina's courage to choose differently. She remained single, not actively dating but not avoiding it either. She'd had a brief connection with someone passing through town, enjoyable but not substantial enough to pursue. She'd learned to be content with her own company in ways she never had been when constantly seeking external validation through relationships. She suspected she'd eventually open herself to partnership again, but only with someone who valued authenticity as much as she now did. The second anniversary of Marina's arrival in Ravens Bay coincided with a community celebration of the town's founding. There was a festival with food vendors, local artists selling their work, live music, and general festivity. Marina had a booth selling ceramics from River's studio, and she'd contributed several pieces she was proud of, work that showed genuine skill development. Between customers, she watched the celebration with a sense of belonging she'd never felt in Chicago, despite living there for 8 years. She knew people here, not just superficially but genuinely. She understood community dynamics, participated in local decisions, contributed to collective well-being. This wasn't just a place she lived. It was a community she belonged to and helped shape. Late in the afternoon, Sarah found Marina at the booth and handed her a book. "Just arrived at the store," she said with a smile. "Thought you'd want to see it immediately." It was a newly published memoir by someone Marina had known tangentially in Chicago, a former colleague who'd left corporate life around the same time she had. The book detailed their journey from burnout to balance, exploring themes similar to Marina's blog. Reading the back cover, Marina felt a pang of something she eventually identified as envy. This person had accomplished what Marina had considered, turning their transformation story into a published book. But the feeling passed quickly, replaced by genuine happiness for the author. Their success didn't diminish Marina's journey. There wasn't a limited supply of authentic living or meaningful work. Someone else writing about similar themes didn't make her experience less valid. This was growth, Marina realized, being able to celebrate others' achievements without seeing them as threats to her own worth. She bought the book and read it that evening. It was well written and insightful, and Marina found herself taking notes about techniques she admired. She also noticed differences in their approaches and perspectives that made her own voice distinct. Maybe she would write a book someday. Maybe she wouldn't. Either choice could be authentic depending on her actual desires rather than external measures of success. As fall arrived again, Marina began considering what came next. Not in terms of leaving Ravens Bay, which had become home in ways she didn't want to abandon, but in terms of continued growth. She'd healed from the betrayal that brought her here. She'd discovered creative abilities and built community connections. She'd learned to live authentically rather than performatively. What else was she being called toward? The answer emerged gradually through various conversations and experiences. Marina recognized that her most fulfilling work involved helping others navigate transitions similar to hers. The informal coaching she'd been doing felt valuable but haphazard. What if she developed more structure around it? What if she created workshops or retreats specifically for people considering major life changes? She discussed this possibility with River, Ben, Sarah, and others whose judgment she trusted. They were unanimously encouraging. River offered her studio space for workshops. Ben suggested partnering to incorporate outdoor activities into retreat experiences. Sarah proposed that the bookstore could host events focused on career transition and authentic living. The community wanted to support this work. Marina spent several months developing curriculum and materials. She drew on her corporate training experience but adapted those skills toward completely different purposes. Instead of teaching people to be more productive or profitable, she'd help them explore what fulfillment actually meant for them, identify barriers to authentic living, and develop courage to choose differently despite fear. She launched her first workshop in early spring, limiting attendance to 10 people to keep it intimate. Participants ranged from a 25-year-old questioning career choices to a 62-year-old preparing for retirement. Over 2 intensive days, they explored values clarification, examined cultural conditioning around success, identified authentic desires versus inherited expectations, and developed practical strategies for making changes. The workshop exceeded Marina's hopes. Participants were fully engaged, vulnerable with each other, and seemingly transformed by the experience. Several told her afterward that these 2 days had given them clarity they'd been seeking for years. They'd been given permission to want something different and tools to move toward it. Word spread quickly, and Marina's subsequent workshops filled within days of opening registration. She increased frequency and experimented with different formats: weekend intensives, ongoing groups, one-on-one coaching. She developed partnerships with other retreat centers beyond Ravens Bay, expanding her reach while maintaining the town as her home base. This work generated sustainable income for the first time since leaving Chicago. Marina wasn't wealthy, but she earned enough to feel financially secure while doing work that felt deeply purposeful. She'd finally integrated her professional skills with her personal values, creating something that honored both her capabilities and her authenticity. 2.5 years into her Ravens Bay residency, Marina received an unexpected email from Westbrook Industries, her former employer. The company had undergone significant changes following several scandals and leadership transitions. New CEO wanted to rebuild company culture around values-based leadership and employee well-being. They'd somehow discovered Marina's transformation work and wanted to hire her as a consultant. The offer was substantial financially, more than she'd earned monthly in her former role. They wanted her to develop and deliver programming around authentic leadership, work-life integration, and organizational culture transformation. They promised complete creative freedom and emphasized that they'd fly her in quarterly rather than requiring relocation. Marina's first instinct was to decline immediately. Return to the organization she'd fled? Work with the type of corporate culture she'd escaped? It felt like regression, like abandoning everything she'd learned. But before responding, she sat with the offer for several days, examining her resistance. Was she rejecting the opportunity because it genuinely conflicted with her values, or because she'd created a binary where corporate work was inherently inauthentic? Could she engage with that world while maintaining her integrity? Was there value in bringing authenticity principles into organizations that desperately needed them? She discussed it extensively with her Ravens Bay community. River pointed out that transformation wasn't about completely rejecting your past, but integrating lessons learned. Ben mentioned that some of his most meaningful impact came from helping former corporate colleagues imagine different possibilities. Sarah reminded her that spreading these ideas required meeting people where they were, not just serving those who'd already chosen alternative paths. Marina realized her initial resistance came from fear of being reabsorbed into a world she'd left, fear of compromising her values for money, fear of discovering she'd been wrong about corporate work being incompatible with authentic living. But those fears were about avoiding discomfort rather than protecting her integrity. She decided to accept the consulting offer with clear boundaries. She'd commit to quarterly visits but maintain Ravens Bay as her home. She'd only work with Westbrook if they genuinely implemented her recommendations, rather than using her work as performative window dressing. She'd reserve the right to end the partnership if it compromised her values, and she'd stay connected to her community and practices that kept her grounded. The first consulting visit was surreal. Walking back into corporate environments triggered old patterns and anxieties Marina thought she'd overcome. But she'd changed fundamentally, and she brought that changed perspective into every interaction. She spoke about authenticity and values not as abstract concepts, but as practical necessities for sustainable performance. She challenged executives to examine whether their leadership approach served their actual objectives or just perpetuated inherited models. To her surprise, the work was well received. Westbrook's leadership was genuinely committed to transformation, likely because their survival depended on it after recent crises. Marina's perspective as someone who'd left corporate life and rebuilt differently gave her credibility and insights current employees couldn't provide. She wasn't theorizing about alternative possibilities. She was living proof they were viable. Over the following months, Marina developed a rhythm integrating her consulting work with her Ravens Bay life and her ongoing workshop offerings. It was complex, requiring careful energy management and strong boundaries, but also deeply fulfilling. She was bringing transformation principles to people who needed them, but couldn't leave conventional systems, while maintaining her own authentic path. This integration challenged Marina's previous either-or thinking. She'd initially believed authentic living required completely rejecting conventional career paths. Now she understood it was more nuanced. Some people needed to leave corporate environments to discover authenticity as she had. Others could maintain their careers while transforming their relationship to that work. Still others were called to bring transformation principles into traditional organizations. There wasn't one right path, only many possibilities for living with integrity. Marina's third year in Ravens Bay brought unexpected developments. The cottage she'd been renting came up for sale, and the owner offered her first right of purchase. This required a decision she'd been avoiding. Was this temporary refuge becoming permanent home? Buying property meant commitment, roots, choosing this place over keeping options open. She surprised herself by not hesitating. Yes, Ravens Bay was home. Yes, she wanted roots here. Yes, she was ready to commit to this community and place. She arranged financing, made the purchase, and became a homeowner for the first time. The cottage was truly hers now, and she could make whatever changes she wanted. She started transforming the neglected garden into a proper outdoor sanctuary. She painted walls in colors that brought her joy. She replaced the outdated kitchen with something functional and beautiful. She was nesting in ways she never had in her Chicago penthouse, creating space that reflected her authentic preferences rather than design trends. River helped her select furniture from James's workshop, each piece handcrafted specifically for Marina's space and needs. Ben assisted with building a fire pit in the back garden. Sarah contributed overflowing bookshelves. Her cottage became an expression of her transformed life. Simple but not sparse, beautiful but not showy, functional but not merely utilitarian. It was comfortable and authentic and completely hers. Marina's work continued evolving. Her workshop offerings expanded to include online components, reaching people who couldn't travel to in-person events. She published a series of workbooks and guided journals supporting transformation work. She started a podcast featuring conversations with people who'd made major life changes, exploring both successes and challenges honestly. The blog she'd started as personal processing evolved into a substantial platform. She had over 100,000 newsletter subscribers and had been featured in major publications. Literary agents contacted her regularly about book deals. She'd become somewhat well-known in spaces focused on career transition and authentic living. This visibility brought complications. Marina struggled with the tension between sharing authentically and maintaining privacy. She was learning where to draw boundaries about what she shared publicly versus what remained personal. She was navigating how to be visible without becoming performative, how to have a platform without losing herself to it. She'd also started receiving criticism. Inevitable once your audience grows. Some accused her of privilege, pointing out that her transformation was enabled by substantial savings from her corporate career. Others suggested she was romanticizing poverty or irresponsibility. Some questioned whether her lifestyle was sustainable long-term or just an extended rebellious phase. The criticism stung even when she recognized kernels of truth in it. Marina tried to address valid critiques thoughtfully. She acknowledged that her transformation was enabled by resources many people lacked. She clarified that she wasn't advocating everyone abandon careers, but rather suggesting they examine whether their work aligned with their values. She admitted uncertainty about long-term sustainability while defending her right to prioritize present authenticity over guaranteed future security. But some criticism was simply projection or misunderstanding, and she learned to release it without internalization. Not everyone would understand or appreciate her choices, and that was okay. She wasn't living her life for external validation anymore, even though old habits of seeking approval still surfaced occasionally. 4 years after arriving in Ravens Bay, Marina woke one morning and realized she was genuinely happy, not in a forced gratitude way or a denial of challenges way, but in a deep contentment with her actual life. She loved her cottage, her community, her work, and the person she was becoming. She still had difficult days and ongoing struggles, but the overall trajectory felt right. She'd recently reconnected with a few former colleagues from Chicago, not to reclaim old relationships but to acknowledge shared history. Some had left Westbrook Industries and made their own changes, inspired partly by Marina's example. Others remained but had transformed their relationship to the work. A few expressed envy but weren't ready or willing to change. Marina felt compassion for all of them without judgment about their choices. Her relationship with her family had continued deepening. Her parents were proud of her in ways they'd never been when she was climbing corporate ladders. Her sister considered Marina a role model for her young daughter, someone who chose authenticity over convention. Her brother had started questioning his own path, though he wasn't ready to leave law yet. They'd become closer through Marina's transformation rather than distanced by it. Marina had started dating someone she met through her workshops, a former engineer who'd left his job to start an architectural firm focused on sustainable design. It was early but promising, built on shared values and mutual appreciation for each other's authentic paths. They were both cautious, having been hurt before, but willing to risk vulnerability for genuine connection. She continued her work with Westbrook Industries, now in her 3rd year of consulting there. The organization had genuinely transformed, implementing policies around flexible work, values-based leadership, and employee well-being. Several executives credited Marina's program with saving their careers and marriages. She'd proven that transformation principles could apply even in conventional corporate contexts when leadership was committed. But her heart remained in the workshop and coaching work, helping individuals navigate their own transformations. She'd worked with hundreds of people by now, witnessing countless versions of awakening to authenticity. Each person's journey was unique, but common themes emerged. The courage required to question inherited scripts, the grief accompanying the release of false selves, the terror and exhilaration of uncertain futures, and the profound peace available through alignment between values and choices. Marina had become something she never intended, a guide for others on transformation journeys. Not because she'd figured everything out or reached some enlightened endpoint, but because she was willing to be honest about the messy, non-linear reality of choosing authenticity over performance. She'd learned that helping others didn't require having all the answers. It required showing up with genuine presence and compassion.